Robert and I were looking, and we even found, just looking at some of the photographs of Orion, because there's many versions of that machine.
Really?
Many different designs of it to start with. But then we found one that was floating in the water. And it had these funny round balls around it. But no parachutes.
That's a bit strange.
And then it got into a close-up of it, showing there, and you could see the witness marks where it was skidded. They probably had to push it out the back of the airplane. And you can see the skid marks up the side of it, where they obviously pushed it out. And they could have been doing it for practice or demonstration to see how the parachutes worked or anything else. But this thing in the water did not have any chutes attached to it.
We thought it got pushed out the back of a boat.
Witness marks.
That new Orion is being assembled at the moment, isn't it?
No, I actually looked it up. The Orion is completely in its capsule, encased, ready to be put on top of a rocket.
That's right, yeah.
Why are they putting a capsule on top of an untested rocket?
They're supposed to have another one in 22, and then in 23 they're going to do an unmanned orbit around the moon and back again. And SpaceX rockets don't have hardly enough to lift Captain Kirk's weight. Yet this thing's going to take them around and back again, and it's going to need a bit more power than that. Like I showed Robert, the article said it's ready to go. All I have to do is lift it on.
It's the same thrust that was produced on the second stage of the Apollo rocket. You know, they were 200,000 pounds of thrust each. There were 5 of them, which was quite a lot. You know, managed to get it into the Atlantic pretty fast, didn't it? And the idea put forward by our favourite parrot, Pete Bassett, that of course they didn't go into Earth orbit, because you could see them if they were. And I'm thinking, hang on a minute, what's he talking about? You could see them if they were in Earth orbit. I mean, how many times have you looked up in the sky? 2021, where there are lots of satellites up there, how many times have you looked up in the sky and seen a satellite going overhead in daylight? And then you find out that the only time you can actually see a satellite going overhead, I've seen a few, is when they are in a particular position so that the Earth is going into shadow and the sun is illuminating them from below. That's when you can see them. You can't see them when the sun is illuminating them from above, because they wouldn't show up. And the only time that they are visible when the sun is illuminating them from below is 5 minutes. It's the time it takes a satellite to cross the horizon, which is not very long. So unless you know exactly where to look and when to look, you won't see a thing.
No, it's the same with the ISS through the telescope. I mean, that thing it comes and it goes.
Yeah, I've seen the ISS, but it was about 2 or 3 minutes. That's all you get to see it for, because that's the only time that the sun will illuminate it from below. So the idea offered that the Apollo command modules went into low Earth orbit, well, of course you can see them, because they're huge, great things. Yes, they are. The command module isn't that big. Command and service module together aren't that big. They're about the size of a hexagon spy satellite. The hexagon is 60 foot long. And how many people saw that in orbit? And that was in polar orbit. It should be easier to see it. But this idea that you could see it if it went into Earth orbit, the Apollo command module, you could see it, is ridiculous. Of course you can't see it, because you don't know where it is, when it is, and you're not looking out for it, because you think it's going to the moon. And there weren't that many satellites around in the late 1960s anyway. There were only the Apollo command modules, and they would be ditching as soon as they could possibly get out of sight. And as you say, get them out of sight, where do they go then? Stage 1, after 50 miles, shuts down. Stage 2, after 2,500 miles, shuts down. 2,500 miles is about the distance from Florida to the eastern Atlantic. That's probably where they ditched.
What about the ones that were said that they were tracking that all the way to the moon? How do you know that they could not have put another package up there beforehand?
Yeah.
Or I remember what the Russians did. They put a tape recorder in the craft when they sent it out, so it sounded like there was somebody in there. Well, what if they sent a package to the moon? Same kind of idea, right? So that somebody had something to track. And if you point to an S-band dish up there, That's exactly where it's coming from, exactly where they said.
Yeah, just before Apollo was allegedly launched, they did put a satellite up into orbit called the ATS, Testing and Training Satellite. Yeah, it was put up there so that they could experience what it would be like having information coming from space. And we're told it was deorbited in December 1968. We're told that. We don't know that for certain, because they can tell us a lot of things that aren't necessarily true. Supposing that satellite was still operating throughout the whole Apollo saga up till December 1972 with Apollo 17. Supposing it was still there. It obviously worked the first time. It would obviously work the second time and the third and the sixth time.
Don't forget they were bouncing those signals halfway around the planet from Australia through, right?
Yep.
And they could have connected with anything then. And at launch time, they had tons of planes and ships on the water as well as planes in the air.
Yeah.
That they could run the signals off of. And of course, in case there was an abort, they had to make sure the shipping lanes were clear, that they didn't have an accident that way. And the alternative to that is they secured the entire Atlantic Ocean so that wherever that thing fell, that nobody was going to see it.
It's just a shame the Russians were having some naval exercises when Apollo 13 launched.
And they pick up the command module.
Yeah. None of the parrots have ever answered the question, what was that command module doing floating in the Atlantic the day after the official launch of Apollo 13? They've never addressed it. They won't even think about it. They won't even go anywhere near it, because if they did, they would see that the whole story of Apollo 13 was fake. Parrots, here is your mission, should you choose to accept it. Explain what an Apollo command module, whether it's a boilerplate 1227 or the official Apollo 13 command module, doesn't matter. Something was floating in the Atlantic Ocean the day after the official launch of Apollo 13. Right, parrots, why was it floating there? What was it doing there? Who lost it? And what was it about?
And why can't we see it now?
Exactly. Why has it been sealed till 2076? It's a Grand Rapids Museum if you want to go and see it. It's on display. There's nothing hidden. The official Apollo 13 command module is at the Kansas Cosmodrome. That's on display too. Why have you got two Apollo 13 command modules on display? Come on, parrots, answer that one. Or are you so ridiculously infected by NASA's story that you can't even think about it? Come on, get real, guys. Get out there, do some proper research, and stop just whittering on about how wrong we all are. We're not wrong. We know what we're talking about. We've done the research. You haven't. You just parrot NASA. So get on and do some proper research, and then we'll find out what's really going on. Because until we do, if we don't find out what's going on now, we're going to still continue this ridiculous charade of launching rockets into space that haven't got the idea behind them that Apollo had. Apollo, when it was conceived back in the mid-1960s, it was a very good idea. But something went wrong. They discovered something about space travel that they still haven't talked about, because they haven't been beyond the Van Allen radiation belt since with a human, and they say they're going to do it. I don't think they will. We'll just watch, shall we? Because we're now sufficiently clued up to know what effect it would have on humans to go through the Van Allen belts. That's not the important part. Going through them isn't important. It's what happens beyond them that's important. Because beyond the Van Allen belts, space is full of radioactivity and radiation. And humans are not designed to deal with that, not at the strength that you would encounter beyond the Van Allen belts. So come on, guys, get your thinking hats on and do some proper research.
My biggest question is why does everything work in space, but when it's tested down here in the same conditions replicated here on the Earth, it fails? But then, when it magically gets into space, it works.
Yep.
That is one thing that really gets me. I mean, You have rubber seals that outgas and they're useless. They seem to work in space. You have those suits that have those zippers on them that are made out of rubber and with stitch holes all through them. Yet when they're tested down here, they fail. When you're up in space, they work. Why can't they add an airlock onto the Sandusky vacuum chamber and just have teams of researchers going in and out of there all day long?
That's where they should be testing all of their equipment.
Let's say, for example, water outgasses here in a vacuum chamber at whatever value. Well, it's going to do the same thing in space.
Yeah.
That's been proven. So if blood outgasses in a vacuum chamber on Earth, then it's going to do the same thing when they get into space. But once you actually get into space, all of a sudden the rules change.
Yeah, everything works.
Everything works. A good example of this was the Morpheus vehicle. A few tests, it goes up and it comes down, then it comes down and they want to test it again. Well, it didn't get very far, it tipped over and it blew up. So what I'd like them to do was take one of these vehicles, send it up, give it 2 or 3 orbits, and then let it come down on its own thrusters and land, just like they did with the Mars rover. Let's just see you deorbit the thing and then land it. That kind of thing's never been tested. But guess what? As soon as they send it to the moon, it works. I mean, look at the Surveyor craft. How many of those did they send there? And it just works. And then they send these ones to Mars. Well, it just works. So how are they going to send something out into space, test it by letting it go around 1 or 2 orbits, and then landing it, sending it down on parachutes, cut the parachutes, and let's just see a soft touchdown with those rocket engines going. I've never seen one test anywhere that NASA has done that works. Everything works in space, but it will not work here in the testing.
I still haven't figured out how they could soft land on an asteroid. Like the fastest acceleration that we've got is what, 25,700 miles an hour?
Yep.
Yeah. How are they going to soft land on an asteroid that's traveling 300,000 miles an hour? First they have to get out and meet it, then they got to turn around and catch up to it and soft land on it. I don't know how that happens on a little wee package like what they've got, right?
What sort of heat shield will they need coming back from that far out in space?
Those things don't need it. They only need a heat shield if somebody says you need a heat shield.
Look at Orion. Look at the heat tiles that are all over that thing. The windows.
There's people on board.
Did you see any heat tiles on Apollo on the craft? Big heat shield on the bottom? I haven't. Oh, by the way, one Orion capsule has all these heat tiles on it. Then you get a different Orion capsule, and it's got maybe half up to the window. Then you have a different Orion capsule that doesn't have any at all.
The other thing that we should be talking about, of course, is the repressurization of a spacecraft, especially when it's in a full vacuum. Because when you look up oxygen and nitrogen and the temperature that they become a liquid at, nitrogen is minus 196 degrees Celsius. It becomes a liquid. But you can bring it to a liquid by using pressure. So if you put 750 psi in a container and squish it down, it'll become a liquid like that.
Okay.
You can touch it, it's not cold to touch because you're at room temperature, right? But technically it has the same effect as being at minus 196. When you expand that back out into a void, and of course that's going to be a complete void out there, that vacuum, when you're repressurizing it, it's going to start absorbing heat as it expands, right? And it's going to grab the heat from every surface that's available. And of course there's no air in there, so there's none to grab from there. So it's only going to be the surface of the craft and any contents that's inside it. And it's going to cool it down, right? If they're using pure oxygen, it's just slightly lower temperature. I think it's 186 or 183, minus 183, something like that. that it becomes a liquid. So if you put that in a container and you pressurize it with at least 750 pounds, you want to put more in than that so it stays a liquid. It becomes more stable as you're using it. That's why they put 2,000 and 3,000 pounds in them, right? It doesn't give you more oxygen. It just keeps it in a more stable form. So when you release that in, the spacecraft, the aluminum, is going to wrinkle. It's going to shrink from the difference in temperature. The seals will do exactly the same thing. So the door probably would never seal with that change in temperature, especially if it's in the sunlight. Well, the door on the LEM wasn't in the sunlight. It was always in the shade, right? So it's going to be pretty cool on that side. And now you're going to bring it down to minus 160 degrees Celsius almost instantly. If you were in there, and you're going to be in there when this is happening in your spacesuit, even rubberized products, like Robert said, the tips of their gloves are going to shatter like glass. You touch anything. I imagine it would be so cold that the spacesuit itself, if you moved in it, the material would just crack. It would be so brittle at that temperature. So what are these guys doing to sit inside that spacecraft? At that temperature, it's going to drop down to there. Two guys are going to sit in there for a very long time to heat that up. I don't care what kind of heaters they got. They don't have enough battery power in that thing to heat that back up. Even if it took 2 or 3 hours, there's 2 or 3 hours that they're going to be sitting almost motionless, because if they crack that suit, they're going to freeze to death.
Good point.
And that can be demonstrated. I mean, even a can of compressed air. See how long you can hold that within an inch from your skin and see how long it takes you to get a frostbite from it, right? Even the can itself cools down when it's being deployed, right? To the point where you can hardly hang on to the damn things. And that's just a little bit. CO2, dry ice, is minus 19 Celsius, which is still extremely cold. But when you take oxygen and nitrogen, like if they're using an oxygen-nitrogen mix or a pure oxygen mix, it's around minus 320 Fahrenheit, in that range.
Yep.
Just unbelievable that they would go in there and do that. It's just a complete error in simulation. You'd have to put that in slowly and control that temperature inside there so that nothing would happen. And then, of course, they went in. Their storyline, they go inside, they take their suits off, they get something to eat, and they go to bed. Well, your food's going to be frozen solid, buddy. Anything inside that craft is going to be frozen solid. The wiring inside the craft is going to be so brittle that if you touch it, you'd throw a switch, it'll probably just snap off in your hand. I mean, that's kind of brittle that we're talking about here.
Is there any documentation showing what the temperature was in that LM when they were pressurized?
No, of course not. When they go back inside and close the door, the simulation ends because they went back to the hotel. I mean, like, Collins wasn't even there. He was already at the hotel.
But then, if they want to prove that this happened, that they really did it, they're going to have to do it under the conditions, like you say, Robert. You have to do it under the conditions that we know exist, because we know what the temperatures are in space. There isn't any. But if you introduce something like compressed liquid oxygen or compressed liquid nitrogen, that's going to have a temperature, and you can't insulate against that temperature.
Their spacesuits wouldn't be able to handle that. Their heating and cooling units in there wouldn't be able to handle that.
Well, I think it's all these things that have been discovered, whether it's SpaceX or Blue Origin or Branson, he hasn't gone very far, and NASA. They've probably discovered these things, but they don't know what the hell to do about it now, because it will all destroy the Apollo story if they start getting honest, which is what they have to do.
They've got to have an airlock on the spacecraft to be able to avoid this.
Yes.
Because then they can flood the airlock with the interior atmosphere that's in there at room temperature. And that's the same thing that happens when they use a vacuum chamber to test stuff on Earth. They can just use outside air coming in. They're not using a compressed gas that will freeze the hell out of you.
But what about the static electricity that's going to occur?
Well, that's why they injected steam in the early ones in the 60s and had the guys with the copper jackets on with the grounding wires on them to stop the static electricity. And of course, as soon as you inject the steam in there, it neutralizes the static, right?
How's that going to work today? You know, with the CMOS chip that runs on 5 volts TTL, you can't touch those chips or they blow. I mean, you basically look at those chips and they blow. I'd like to see how they're going to solve that one. I mean, how are they going to protect all of those sensitive electronics?
By just telling you that they are protecting them, not showing you how they're protecting them.
Of course, you've got to realize that these chips that they're building are going into the museum.
Here you have an electric motor, for crying out loud. You know, there's the phase controller. The cord goes right here where it attaches right there for the cable. Then there's the seal.
Yeah.
There's 1 bolt, 2 bolt, 3 bolts, and 4 to bolt the thing to the case.
We can do it with CGI, but can we do it for real? Because that's what we want to see. Everybody wants to see it. And for many years, people have believed that they've seen it. And now they're questioning it. Now they're beginning to say, I don't think it's real, NASA. Come on, explain yourself. And that's what we want. We want NASA to explain themselves. And as soon as all their parrots and their supporters and their groupies stop bigging up NASA and saying what wonderful people they are, we might get somewhere. Because at the moment, they're so fixated on proving us wrong rather than examining what NASA are saying. Because there are so many things going on. SpaceX are trying to launch. The SLS is trying to launch. Oh, guess what? The James Webb Space Telescope is going to be launched fairly soon from French Guiana on a French rocket. What's going on, NASA? Haven't you got a rocket that can launch your own space telescope? And the space telescope is going to be put into Lagrange point 2, I think. No, Lagrange point 3.
That way it's not their fault when it's damaged.
Well, we hope it isn't damaged. We hope they manage to get it down to French Guiana.
They won't launch it until they've got the new observatory built with the new telescopes and have them all upgraded so they can use the images from there.
Well, they've been working on this space telescope for so many years now. You think they've probably got it sorted by now, but we'll see when they launch it. It's the standard NASA procedure of this UFO connection. If they're seeing UFOs, whether they're on the way to the moon allegedly or whether they're on the moon, if they're seeing UFOs, they have to be on the moon to see them. Therefore, they got to the moon to see these strange things, which is all part of the dissemination of Apollo. It's adding in these little bits that, you know, you get the astronauts saying that they've seen strange things. They may have seen strange things. Doesn't mean to say they were on the moon to see them.
Well, so, Poppy was running around. Frances Northcutt in her bikini.
Oh, yeah. Oh, dear Frances. What a lovely
She's
lady.
running around. That's something to look at.
It's a lot more interesting than a few UFOs that can't be identified. At least Frances can be identified. That was a very strange piece of film when she appears on the command module.
They claim in that entire video, the entire length of it, they claim that that was being done simultaneously while the astronauts were on the lunar surface, so they had that to show them when they got back.
When they're taking these pictures, allegedly on the moon, I don't think they were, the story goes that they had to clip a little strip of film off as a test developer, which is fine. That's a standard procedure. You cut a few inches off the end of the film, develop that the way you think it should be developed, have a look at the pictures that come through and see if they are developed correctly for the film, so you can then develop the rest of the film at the same time or the same temperatures and all the rest of it. If that happened, they cut a test strip off the end of each film. I've never ever seen those test strips.
Those would be film that actually had pictures in it, right?
Yes, it would, yeah.
Okay, if they know it's going to be a test film, then they should have their color chart like they throw on the ground in, Apollo 14 or whatever?
That's right, yep.
Yeah, they throw the color chart on the ground to calibrate?
Yeah.
So, to give you a calibration? That should have been the first thing that they did before they started shooting.
Yeah, They would throw the colour chart down, they would photograph it. Once you develop the film, they would then have a look at the colour chart in the picture, and that would give an indication as to how accurate they were. But the point is that if they did cut a piece of strip off, which is a logical thing to do,
Yep.
the chances of being able to cut precisely between pictures is so remote, and I've never been able to do it, it's so remote that there'll be at least one exposure on the remainder of the film which was cut in half, or cut in a quarter, or cut a third. You don't see that. You see every single picture on the magazine is a full frame. It's not cut in half, which is why I think this idea of taking test strips, though it's a logical thing to have done, wasn't done in the way we were told, because we don't see any damaged film on the final rolls of film, the magazines, as depicted by NASA. We don't see that. Because it's a logical thing to have done, to cut a test strip off the film, but then you've got to look for the other images which were damaged when you did that, and there aren't any.
Right, and then of course, because the pictures were taken,
Yeah,
they could also display those pictures.
of course they could, but they don't.
And of course, it should have a color chart in it. They had the chart on the gnome, and they had the flat one that they used like in Apollo 14, right? To do that. And that would have been the first thing they did before they started willy-nilly taking pictures all over the place.
And you've got to make sure the camera is working as well. So they would have a color chart out, they'd photograph that. They'd probably, if they were sensible, they'd do it in the shadow and in the full sunlight, so you've got the balance between the two.
So then it would absolutely make no sense to have those numbers in their cue cards on their wrist.
Exactly. Exactly.
Because that's the angle, direction, number of feet you're away, plus the camera settings are on that.
Yep.
Which were done months ahead of time. And there's no way they could know that.
No.
Any of that stuff. Everything you see in there is staging.
Of course it is.
Cue cards are just pure staging, is
Yep.
what it is.
Yep.
They're a storyboard for those guys to follow. It gives them a timeline in which they could do it.
Yep.
And they needed to have the timeline because the cameras had, 4-minute films or 12-minute film, right?
Yep.
For that camera. So they had to do all of the stuff within that time period to shoot it on one reel.
Yeah. And the key word you use there is storyboard.
It's a storyboard.
Which is a classic film term used to depict how a film will be shot, how the camera will be pointed, how long it will take. It's time to the nearest second on a film. I mean, it's expensive business doing a film. You've got to get it right. So they were doing storyboarding. Apollo Lunar Surface Experimental Package, photos taken.
Yeah, taken is in the past tense, of course.
Yeah. AT, F11, 125th, 250th.
Yeah. Sun angle, direction,
An angle, yep.
number of feet your way, 3 feet, 7 feet, 7 feet, 3 feet, 7 feet, 11 feet.
How did they know how far away it was going to be?
Didn't they claim they had trouble judging distances?
Oh, they had terrible trouble judging distances because...
Okay, but that's the RTG. This is all the equipment set up.
Yep.
And you have to be precise with these cameras. You can't mess around with them. And you've got the timeline you're in here, and here's the Apollo 16 Grand Prix.
Standing start, maximum velocity readout.
DAS steering and control comments, to make comments on it, but they showed them, they had to know that these craters were going to be there.
Yep, they did.
And they showed the drive-through one around those two and drive through the last one, which is exactly what they did.
Yep.
And then they have the position cameras, 20 to 50 feet, 20 feet this way, 50 feet that way, right? And the same here. All done out on the thing. And right here, that's the time that they're out. Up on there. Some of them have it done better than that. But just to hear, it's like readout, navigation, and displays. That's instructions.
Left-hand MESA, presumably that's left-hand. Deploy, solar wind collector. It's very detailed, isn't it?
Yeah, but it is not a checklist. And that's what it's supposed to be. How do you know you're going to put the big rocks in this bag? Right? Okay. How do you know you're going to get the rocks?
How do you know it's going to be big compared to what?
Clean and stow the antennas, right? It's not a checklist. And then, like, this one just gets me, right? How to examine the exact size of the boulder they're going to encounter at this station.
0.3 to 0.5 meters. I always thought America used feet and inches.
Well, that's the other problem that I had, but then this is Farouk Albez that was instructing them in this.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Okay, and it's liable for him and his crew that he had with him to do that. Like, this is in feet, 7 feet.
Yeah,
right?
7 feet
5
extra
meters.
stereo after.
Across the sun, so you're sideways to the sun, across the sun,
Yeah.
up close after that, and then this is the description of the contents inside. How do you know the mineral contents inside a rock before you split it open? 4 months before you got there. This is your sun direction, the number of feet, and on this side you have another 5 meters to the axe.
So why isn't it 2 meters on one side? But
It's 5 meters and 7 feet.
yeah, it's very weird that mixing measurements up.
I have to put that one down to Farouk being in there. But whoever did these up, like, there are the people that signed them right there.
Yeah, it did. John Young's one of them. Commander Apollo 16.
And this is a few little instructions here. But after that, you get into it right here. It shows your X, shows the position you're standing in. None of this is a checklist. It's a description on what you're going to see, and what you're going to do, and what you're going to say while you're there.
Hi, Pete. I have read your book again, which was an interesting experience for me in more ways than one. Please, could you let me know some answers to questions I now have about what you have written? Why does the supporting website, www.moonlandinghoax.org, no longer work? It now reverts to GoDaddy. You quote from people who you refer to as hoaxers or skeptics of Apollo and place their quotes in bold type at the start of many chapters of emphasis. There are at least 22 such quotes. There are no names given or references to where the quotation came from. Why not? Did you make them up yourself, claiming that this is what they might have said? In Chapter 3, you state that Bill Kaysing left NASA 5 years before Neil stepped on the moon. Later you say that he left in 1963, which is 6 years before any stepping on the moon. In fact, Bill Kaysing worked for Rocketdyne, not for NASA, where he never claimed to be anything other than a technical writer. Writing was the career he followed after leaving, as well as caring for cats. Bill was known as the fastest pen in the West due to his output. Do you know why Bill titled his book We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion Swindle? Capricorn 1 was financed by Lee Grade's company ATV based in the UK. You must be a big fan of Telly Savalas. He is the only person in the film you mention by name. He had a minor, albeit pivotal role in the storyline. The Fox TV special, Conspiracy Theory, Did We Land on the Moon, was originally broadcast in February of 2001. If that film was the catalyst for children asking you questions about the moon landings, why are they doing it, as you claim, in 1997? Chapter 4 of the books. Your comment about Dark Moon is so one-sided as to be laughable. You quite evidently do not understand what the authors were investigating, let alone what they explained in considerable detail. Maybe you are just being dismissive, as was also the case with Gerhard Wilnowski's book One Small Step. There is no mention of Ralph Renee in his book NASA Mooned America. Why not? That was first published in 1992. Have you watched the film Make Believe Smoke and Mirrors? That explains how easy it was to fake the landings. Doing it for real was much more difficult. How many authors have you actually tried to contact about receiving no replies from? Names, please. Flapping flags. Any flag moving in a vacuum will continue to move until slowed by friction and gravity. When not touched, it will act as if it is a pendulum. The gravitational attraction at the point of movement can then be calculated to establish whether it is on the moon or on Earth. Spoiler alert, it was filmed on Earth. From some of your explanations, I recognize the answers as given by Jay Windley on his website, clavius.org. Is Jay the source of your answers? You are aware that Jay's site has been seriously questioned as to the authenticity and true origin? Jay did that flag with the light behind it explanation on 2003's TV show on which I was also interviewed. Who said that there was some sort of spotlight illuminating the shadow side of the flag? Or is that another fabrication to somehow enhance your reputation among those who are not familiar with the subject as I am? Chapter 9, Fake Moon Rocks. Which hoaxer claimed that the moon rocks are only examined by NASA personnel? Name, please. I have seen the moon rocks in the Science Museum. Have you? It is a few grains of dust encased in plastic with a large label saying moon rock. Those grains of dust could be from anywhere. How would anyone know that it came from the moon? What tests have the Science Museums done on them to ensure that they are displaying correctly labeled items? Or are they just relying on NASA to tell them? Chapter 10. You will know that I own a piece of moon rock. It's quite large, about 100 grams of breccia, and very convincing when I show it at my talks. But is it real? A small amount of basic research would soon establish the Rijksmuseum rock could not be real. It was presented to the Dutch Prime Minister in October 1969. No rocks had been released by then, and no rock of the size shown was ever presented to anyone. The label and rock were found separately and assumed to be connected. The real Dutch moon rock is in storage at the Leiden Museum. What 400 kilograms of samples? You must be more accurate when you quote such figures. It was 382 kilograms, which are allegedly returned by the Apollo 6 missions. Were the varying weights accounted for in the LM ascent stage fuel requirements? All aircraft have to have accurate weights known before takeoff to ensure accurate weight distribution is done correctly and enough fuel available for the proposed flight. I would suggest that you should take your own advice here, examine the full story rather than one sentence. Chapter 11. The Sea Rock. Have you found the original source of evidence in this story? If so, you don't quote it. Please take your own advice and quote these things. Chapter 12. Project Lola. Who made the quote at the start of this chapter? Name, please. I have owned a copy of the Encyclopedia of Space for 30 years and have used those Lola pictures in my talks, so how could anyone possibly claim, as you do, that they have never been seen before is quite beyond me. Please explain why you believe such nonsense. It does your credibility no good at all. What were the dates that the lunar orbiter craft took the lunar surface pictures? You really should include them when making such statements. Before I reach Chapter 13, I will stop now and let you answer the questions and points that I have raised so far. I look forward to hearing from you in due course. Best, Marcus. 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 Marcus.